Welcome to Summit Session number 17. My name is Danielle and I am the Marketing Director at 𝘠𝘶𝘮𝘮𝘪𝘵. We are so happy to have you here with us, and the views expressed today are those of the guest and do not necessarily represent the views of 𝘠𝘶𝘮𝘮𝘪𝘵. Today we'll be talking about the power and impact of storytelling. I'm so thrilled to share a bit more about our presenter, Myaia Holmes. Myaia Holmes is the program manager with Care in Action and the National Domestic Workers Alliance in Michigan. She is also the executive director of the Metro Detroit Mutual Aid, a 2021 Deal Fellow, and VP of Programs with the Minority Freedom Community Fund. They are passionate about a two-part framework to social justice work, both building political power and building self-sustainable communities based on the value framework of mutual aid. Without further ado, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming Myaia.
Hi, everyone. I love a small crowd. I really do. It is my sort of all-time favorite thing, especially for storytelling workshops where we're going to be talking about the stories that affect us and our work the most. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And let me make sure we're looking at the correct slides. Can everyone see Caregivers Are the Future? Awesome. All right. So again, I've already been introduced. Let's see. Sharing is being paused. I hate when things like this happen. All right. Let's try this again. Share screen, do that. All right. And I'm actually going to do a regular present. There we go. Awesome. So again, I am Myaia Holmes from the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Care in Action. Those are the same organization, but they're different. Care in Action is our C4 branch. So all of the fun conversations we have with legislators, and the National Domestic Workers Alliance is our advocacy branch. So I'm here in the advocacy sort of role today, talking about storytelling, how to put together our own stories, and the purpose of storytelling. So quite a few fun things on the agenda today. Very, very quickly, what we're all about, and then talking about why stories even matter, and then getting into how to construct our own stories and when to use our stories as well. And then, of course, a Q&A if necessary, if that is cool with everyone. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance has been around since 2007, founded by 𝘠𝘶𝘮𝘮𝘮𝘮, a wonderful person. I suggest you go follow her on Instagram and Twitter for sure. A strong advocate for sure for care workers of all sorts. So we advocate for nannies, domestic workers, caregivers, migrant workers, who all work and tend to work at least in about 2.5 million households. So that's 2.5 million employers, and that's 2.5 million employees. And it is a very unique industry because of that employee-employer relationship. And so there certainly needs to be folks advocating for professionalization of the workforce, a respect for the workforce, changing the narrative, which is largely what today is about as well. So we do all of that using three main buckets of work. So we try to hold trainings like this, where we can learn how we can shift the narrative around who it is that does this work, what it is, what sort of respect that they deserve. We also build political power through sort of traditional organizing, building those relationships between an organizer and an individual domestic worker, and bringing folks together to demonstrate collective power, having folks educated on different policy and legislation, and having those conversations and those lobbying meetings with legislators. And then what's unique about Care in Action and the National Domestic Workers Alliance is certainly making sure that we're centering at all costs domestic workers and caregivers. I myself am a caregiver, my state director is a caregiver, and we make sure that in everything that we do, we are being responsive to the folks that we're trying to work on behalf of. So that was the spiel, that was the gist, right? I think the most important thing I hope folks get out of this particular workshop is the power and dangers of storytelling, right? Why it's important for domestic workers, caregivers, and nannies specifically to tell their own stories rather than having other folks who are not domestic workers, caregivers, or nannies tell your stories on your behalf. So I have a great video here on the danger of a single story, on a danger of a public narrative that will hopefully work. I've tested it out so many times, but that's often not how things go. Can everyone hear? Audio is not working. It's always something. Let's see. That's all the way up. Let's try. Yes, no, nothing. Okay, we can do this. Let's see. Let me stop share. Go and open this in its own tab. All right, now let's try this. And there coincidentally is a button for optimize for video clip. Share sound. Haha, think I cracked the code. Matrix broken. Okay.
I'm a storyteller, and
Great.
I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well, and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Myaia Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I, too, am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And, as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is 𝘚𝘶𝘮𝘮. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of 𝘚𝘶𝘮. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Tyler, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love, in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Okoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes. The immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer 𝘚𝘶𝘮𝘮𝘪𝘵 calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who were not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Funmi Iyanda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in the Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijaw, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds? Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition? Every time I am home, I am confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist, and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who had moved to the north, and she introduced them to a book about the southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
All right. Ugh, I love that TED Talk. I've seen it probably a million times at this point. And I think it gives us a really sort of succinct, although it's a 20-minute TED Talk, which I'm happy to link anyone to, but it gives us a sort of succinct way of describing the dangers of having a strong, inconsistent, unnuanced public narrative about you as an individual and any of your identities, right? So the way to combat having a single story about you is to tell your own story, is to provide that nuance to say, hey, yes, I am a domestic worker, caregiver, and there is a series of public narratives that may or may not describe me, but I'm also a snowboarder or a skateboarder or a swimmer. I'm a former Olympic athlete. I don't know why I'm having athlete examples. I don't do any athletic anything. I live a sedentary lifestyle, but really pointing out the nuances of our own individual stories then contributes to that public narrative and allows us to center our experiences and to build collective power. So that being said, let's talk very quickly about the purpose of the story before we get into the very shoppy part. Oh, now it wants to work. Don't do that. Okay. So our stories allow a few things, right? And I think that TED Talk, again, is an amazing example of all three of these, right? We can connect with other people. We can show them what it is that we value about ourselves, about others, about the world. And, in the vein of my organization, we can use our stories to influence legislation. I have several examples that I will not talk about here because of organizational compliance issues, but I have several examples of instances where we've had meetings with legislators and we can give them the stats and the numbers and the 50% of your constituents, but having someone there who knows how to craft and practice and orate a really great story is usually the sort of deciding factor for, okay, I'll vote yes on this, I'll vote no on this, right? I will speak up on your behalf. I think we all have examples of movies and of stories and of stories passed down to us generationally that influence the way we see ourselves and the way we see our world and the things that we want to do, and can really, really move people to act differently, just on an empathy level, on an understanding level, and a connection level. So our stories are extremely powerful, but the looming question at this point is always, okay, how do you tell your story? And there's a wonderful framework called The Story of Self, of Us, and of Now, which describes 3 separate stories interwoven together to give one really succinct story. And when it's practiced, it's usually 5 minutes. And again, it's like watching The Notebook. It very much tugs at the heartstrings and allows one to really get their own story out there. So here are some of the purposes of our stories that we sort of talked about. So the biggest one, of course, is moving people to action. If you want to get someone to do something, you could use threats or violence if that's your choice, I suppose. But one of the kinder ways to do that is to go, well, here are the ways that, insert identity, insert demographic, insert job position. Here's how we're being harmed. Let's talk to some of the folks who are most directly affected by this thing, whether it's legislation or whether it's a single story or a public narrative, and you can awaken them to injustice in that way. You are able to empower other folks to confront the injustices that they see. You're able to get them to empathize with you, and you're also able to decide things like, okay, how do we go about getting our legislators to vote yes on this bill? What are the actual issues that we are collectively facing? How do you get folks on a team to really feel like they belong to a team? And the answer to all of these questions is through storytelling. So our story of self is, I think, the most upfront. Why is it that you're telling your story? What challenges have you faced in the story that you're telling? Whether that's I have faced harassment and abuse in this workplace, but I really love these kids, and these kids are attached to me, and I feel like I'm a part of their adult guidance and their parent team. But I, have really struggled with their parents and my employers, and trying to navigate bodily autonomy or autonomy over my time, or whatever those issues sort of are. And then the story of us is I have, through Adventure Nannies or through connecting with other folks on Facebook, on social media, out in the real world, have seen that a lot of us are facing these same issues. We don't feel like we have any protections in place for things like abuse in the workplace, harassment in the workplace, right? We don't have the same protections that a 9-to-5 office job sort of has, or we can go to an HR department. So we are feeling lost and confused and unsafe, right? And then you want to share your, the biggest thing is the price of inaction. So if things do not change, right, insert thing here, if we are unable to find protections for harassment, maybe that is we're going to continue to be harassed, or maybe it is we won't be able to care for the loved ones of others anymore, which is the backbone of our economy, right? If I can't find childcare, then I can't go to that 9-to-5 or that factory job, right? So without us, everything is falling apart, right? Sharing that call to action, because everything will fall apart without us. We're asking you to vote yes for labor protections, or yes for harassment protections in the workplace for all. And so that's the formula. Let me stop sharing. That is the formula. That is the big takeaway, or those 3 buckets. I was going to say 2. Those 3 buckets, and I'm actually going to place those in the chat as well, because everyone is going to be put, I think, in this, we can do the same breakout room, because so I'm going to put everyone in a breakout room to answer the question, or to fill in the blank of my story of self is, my story of us is, and my story of now is. And I will put that in the chat as well. So let's see, assign, try to move quickly. And open all rooms. Perfect. So you should be getting a prompt to join that room, and then I will add all of the information you need in there. Where is it? Okay, I'm going to go into the breakout room as well, just to drop these things in the chat.
All right, folks, just to give you a little synopsis of what we're doing right now, everyone's in a breakout room. So for everybody that's watching this recording later, what we're discussing is the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. With the story of self, what we're digging into is what calls me to leadership, what challenges have I faced, and what choices have I made, and describe the results of those choices and shed light on what gives me hope. And then the other part of the story is the story of us. I seek to learn the stories of members of my community. I weave these stories together around values that we share, describe who we are, what our shared challenges are, and some milestones in our journey. And then the final piece of this storytelling trio is the story of now. What is the price of inaction? Share images portraying the consequences of inaction. And then you end the narrative with a specific and doable call to action. And this is how you can put together an entire story sharing your experience as a professional care provider. We'll be back all together in just one moment here.
Back. I hope that went well. We can share out and ask some questions shortly. I think the best thing after practicing something is to see how it's done once it's done. So we have a clip that will work inside of here of for President Barack Obama, 2004 Democratic National Convention. And as you listen, I would try to identify his story of self, his story of us, and his story of now. This is like, it's very much sort of a trilogy here, very epic poem style. Reminds me of the Odyssey, but let's go ahead and play that.
Let me express my deepest gratitude.
Can we hear?
For the privilege of addressing this convention. Tonight is a particular...
And that was my fault. Lovely. I love a mouth. Okay, let's try that again.
Let me express my deepest gratitude for the privilege of addressing this convention. Tonight is a particular honor for me because, let's face it, my presence on this stage is pretty unlikely. My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats, went to school in a tin roof shack. His father, my grandfather, was a cook, a domestic servant to the British. But my grandfather had larger dreams for his son. Through hard work and perseverance, my father got a scholarship to study in a magical place, America, that shone as a beacon of freedom and opportunity to so many who had come before. While studying here, my father met my mother. She was born in a town on the other side of the world, in Kansas. Her father worked on oil rigs and farms through most of the Depression. The day after Pearl Harbor, my grandfather signed up for duty, joined Patton's army, marched across Europe. Back home, my grandmother raised a baby and went to work on a bomber assembly line. After the war, they studied on the GI Bill, bought a house through FHA, and later moved west, all the way to Hawaii in search of opportunity. And they too had big dreams for their daughter. A common dream born of two continents. My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. They would give me an African name, Barack, or Blessed, believing that in a tolerant America, your name is no barrier to success. They imagined me going to the best schools in the land, even though they weren't rich, because in a generous America, you don't have to be rich to achieve your potential. They're both passed away now. And yet I know that on this night, they look down on me with great pride. They stand here, and I stand here today, grateful for the diversity of my heritage, aware that my parents' dreams live on in my two precious daughters. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. Tonight, we gather to affirm the greatness of our nation, Not because of the height of our skyscrapers or the power of our military or the size of our economy. Our pride is based on a very simple premise, summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the true genius of America. A faith in simple dreams, an insistence on small miracles, that we can tuck in our children at night and know that they are fed and clothed and safe from harm, that we can say what we think, write what we think without hearing a sudden knock on the door, that we can have an idea and start our own business without paying a bribe, that we can participate in the political process without fear of retribution, and that our votes will be counted, at least most of the time. This year, in this election, we are called to reaffirm our values and our commitments, to hold them against a hard reality, and see how we're measuring up to the legacy of our forebears and the promise of future generations. And fellow Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, I say to you tonight, we have more work to do. More work to do for the workers I met in Galesburg, Illinois, who are losing their union jobs at the Maytag plant that's moving to Mexico, and now are having to compete with their own children for jobs that pay $7 an hour. More to do for the father that I met who was losing his job and choking back the tears, wondering how he would pay $4,500 a month for the drugs his son needs without the health benefits that he counted on. More to do for the young woman in East St. Louis, and thousands more like her, who has the grades, has the drive, has the will, but doesn't have the money to go to college. Now, don't get me wrong. The people I meet in small towns and big cities, in diners and office parks, they don't expect government to solve all their problems. They know they have to work hard to get ahead, and they want to. Go into the collar counties around Chicago, and people will tell you they don't want their tax money wasted by a welfare agency or by the Pentagon. Go into any inner city neighborhood, and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach our kids to learn. They know that parents have to teach, that children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth with a book is acting white. They know those things. People don't expect government to solve all their problems, but they sense deep in their bones that with just a slight change in priorities, we can make sure that every child in America has a decent shot at life, and that the doors of opportunity remain open to all. They know we can do better, and they want that choice. In this election, we offer that choice. Our party has chosen a man to lead us who embodies the best this country has to offer, and that man is John Kerry. John Kerry understands the ideals of community, faith, and service because they've defined his life. From his heroic service to Vietnam, to his years as a prosecutor and lieutenant governor, through 2 decades in the United States Senate, he's devoted himself to this country. Again and again, we've seen him make tough choices when easier ones were available. His values and his record affirm what is best in us. John Kerry believes in an America where hard work is rewarded. So instead of offering tax breaks to companies shipping jobs overseas, he offers them to companies creating jobs here at home. John Kerry believes in an America where all Americans can afford the same health coverage our politicians in Washington have for themselves. John Kerry believes in energy independence, so we aren't held hostage to the profits of oil companies or the sabotage of foreign oil fields. John Kerry believes in the constitutional freedoms that have made our country the envy of the world, and he will never sacrifice our basic liberties, nor use faith as a wedge to divide us. And John Kerry believes that in a dangerous world, war must be an option sometimes, but it should never be the first option. You know, a while back, I met a young man named Seamus in a VFW hall in East Moline, Illinois. He was a good-looking kid, 6'2", 6'3", clear-eyed with an easy smile. He told me he joined the Marines and was heading to Iraq the following week. And as I listened to him explain why he'd enlisted, the absolute faith he had in our country and its leaders, his devotion to duty and service, I thought, this young man was all that any of us might ever hope for in a child. But then I asked myself, are we serving Seamus as well as he's serving us? I thought of the 900 men and women, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, friends and neighbors who won't be returning to their own hometowns. I thought of the families I'd met who were struggling to get by without a loved one's full income, or whose loved ones had returned with a limb missing or nerves shattered, but still lacked long-term health benefits because they were reservists. When we send our young men and women into harm's way, we have a solemn obligation not to fudge the numbers or shade the truth about why they are going, to care for their families while they're gone, to tend to the soldiers upon their return, and to never, ever go to war without enough troops to win the war, secure the peace, and earn the respect of the world. Now let me be clear. Let me be clear. We have real enemies in the world. These enemies must be found, they must be pursued, and they must be defeated. John Kerry knows this. And just as Lieutenant Kerry did not hesitate to risk his life to protect the men who served with him in Vietnam, President Kerry will not hesitate one moment to use our military might to keep America safe and secure. John Kerry believes in America, and he knows that it's not enough for just some of us to prosper. For alongside our famous individualism, there's another ingredient in the American saga, a belief that we're all connected as one people. If there's a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me even if it's not my child. If there's a senior citizen somewhere who can't pay for their prescription drugs and having to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer even if it's not my grandparent. If there's an Arab American family being rounded up without benefit of an attorney or due process, that threatens my civil liberties. It is that fundamental belief. It is that fundamental belief, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that makes this country work. It's what allows us to pursue our individual dreams and yet still come together as one American family. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them, too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. There are patriots who oppose the war in Iraq, and they're patriots who supported the war in Iraq. We are one people, all of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, all of us defending the United States of America. In the end, that's what this election is about. Do we participate in a politics of cynicism, or do we participate in a politics of hope? John Kerry calls on us to hope. John Edwards calls on us to hope. I'm not talking about blind optimism here. The almost willful ignorance that thinks unemployment will go away if we just don't think about it, or healthcare crisis will solve itself if we just ignore it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something more substantial. It's the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs. The hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores. The hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta. The hope of a mill worker who dares to defy the odds. The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too. Hope in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty, the audacity of hope. In the end, that is God's greatest gift to us, the bedrock of this nation, a belief in things not seen, a belief that there are better days ahead. I believe that we can give our middle class relief and provide working families with a road to opportunity. I believe we can provide jobs to the jobless, homes to the homeless, and reclaim young people in cities across America from violence and despair. I believe that we have a righteous wind at our backs, and that as we stand on the crossroads of history, we can make the right choices and meet the challenges that face us. America, tonight, if you feel the same energy that I do, if you feel the same urgency that I do, if you feel the same passion that I do, if you feel the same hopefulness that I do, if we do what we must do, then I have no doubt that all across the country, from Florida to Oregon, from Washington to Maine, the people will rise up in November, and John Kerry will be sworn in as president, and John Edwards will be sworn in as vice president, and this country will reclaim its promise, and out of this long political darkness, a brighter day will come. Thank you very much, everybody. God bless you. Thank you.
All right. It's a long example, but it's a great one. Let's see. We don't want to watch that again. And that is the story of us, the story of self, the story of the story of now. I was not voting in 2004. So I have no stronger cohesive thoughts on in that, to be quite frank. But now is the time for questions, feedback, concerns, thoughts.
So we've got a question actually coming in from a viewer who is watching. They are interested in understanding how do we learn more about Care in Action or about National Domestic Workers Alliance? How do we become more involved in advocating for folks in this industry?
Yeah, so my email, which I will put in the chat, but I also will put so folks who are watching the recording can see, is here. We are in several different states, and so I'm sure there is a state near you that is happy to have your membership and happy to have you especially get in these rooms with legislators and tell your stories to advocate for great policy and legislation around care workers, domestic workers, caregivers, etc. And there's also just like fun stuff to do, like fun community to find, relationships to build with other care workers as well that they have to offer you. So if you send me an email, I can get you to the right person for your state. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, I can get you to the right person. in your state, and then from there you can sort of get in where you fit in, whether that's being on a volunteer team, whether that's these meetings, these lobby meetings with legislators, whether that's supporting other events that your state's program has going.
That's amazing. You know, I think especially as we have, you know, International Nanny Recognition Week coming up this next week, it's just so incredible to hear from you and to see these amazing examples that you shared about how important and powerful storytelling can be and how vital it is for each of us to kind of look at the many different ways that we have developed certain narratives in our minds about individual people or about groups of people based on that single story idea, and really looking at, okay, what can I do to not only share my story and you know, acknowledge the impact that that could have in broadening the perspective of others, but also what can I do to kind of engage with other people and other stories so that I'm not sort of funneling myself into a single story narrative about any other one group of people. I just found that TED Talk that you shared really inspiring and just a beautiful example of something that I think we've all encountered. And I think, you know, looking at that sort of dichotomy between what we have in terms of assumptions about other people and looking at how we can adjust our perspective by really purposefully seeking out knowledge and different stories, and then looking at also what is the perception that other people may have of me, of the work that I'm doing, of the industry that I'm a part of, and what can I do to amplify the voices of others, and to also be looking at how I can contribute and share to this narrative to really broaden everyone's understanding of the realities that domestic workers face and the incredible ongoing battle towards equity.
Right. Of course, and I always think that that story of us and now framework is always really, really great. Because one, I just think it's really simple. Then it also provides a really easy way to start telling your stories to your spouses and to your children, to your friends, in a way that's far more succinct than what we just saw. Right? It can be like a sentence per category, but being able to be seen and be understood by others is the biggest to sort of shift the narrative in our own households and have that grow from there. So these are always my favorite workshops to do, because I think being able to tell our story is a not just art, but is an art that we don't talk about a lot. Being able to, you know, channel emotion and the rawness and the passion of it all, but also have some structure so that we can capture folks' attention and be able to understand us more and be act on that understanding as well. So always lovely to do these storytelling shops with folks.
Well, Myaia, I can't thank you enough. I've just been kind of sitting here with my mouth agape, trying to not make a weird face, but everything that you've shared has really been so incredible. And I feel like it's going to take me some time to really digest this and sort of see what I can do to put this into practice myself. And I think that our audience, you know, may potentially be feeling the same way. I really appreciate the framework that you've provided that is really simple, but is also something that can be used to build a more complex story, but it can also be used to just begin the conversation of telling your story in a way that really is engaging for other people, but that also, you know, ultimately is unifying and kind of ultimately then ends in a call to action and, you know, creates change. And I just really think that, you know, what you've shared today is incredibly powerful. So thank you so much for your time and for putting this together for us and for taking the time on a weekend to share all of this amazing information. I really appreciate you, Myaia.
And I appreciate you all. If you want the slide deck for anyone, you can go ahead and shoot me an email as well, and I'll get you a PDF version of that. But you can also, I did not create the framework of that I provided today, so you can also just do a Google, but did want a reminder out there. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you have been such a pleasure. And I just feel like we are so lucky to have the chance to speak with you and to get kind of a peek into all of the amazing work that you're involved with right now. So thank you so much for your time. So for more information about this session, be sure to check out CARE in Action and the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We're going to have a blog post to wrap up all of this with a lot of the resources that Myaia has shared. And we'll take a look at that slide deck and try to get some of the slides shared as well so that people have access to this amazing framework and can have the resources needed to develop a deeper understanding of how to put this into practice. So thank you again from all of us at Adventure Nannies, and we hope that everyone has a fantastic International Nanny Recognition Week, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.